military died during the war, that there's a shitload of bodies. Okay? Massive numbers, unprecedented numbers of dead human bodies to be dealt with. It had been the custom for some time that those who were rich enough, families that were rich enough, would try to repatriate their dead bodies of their sons, okay, and bring them back and construct a little memorial to them and all the rest of it. Such was the scale of the casualties, it was really impossible to do that. And the state, moreover, makes a very important decision that there couldn't be an inequality in the treatment of dead soldiers. They insisted that basically that men should be treated democratically in their experience of death. It's a very important step forward. So, and again, this is completely unprecedented. The state basically takes control of dead bodies. It says to the families, I'm sorry, it's your son, I know, but basically we're going to deal with it. We're going to decide where this person is buried. We're going to decide what is on the inscription of the grave. And the organization that becomes central to this was called the Imperial War Graves Commission. Okay, they have a whole commission that basically figures out how they're going to design and build and deal with this problem. They build over 500 cemeteries overseas and have 400,000 headstones and 100,000 crosses. And as you'll see from this example, have any of you been to any of the great cemeteries in France, Verdun or yeah, Tom? Ypres, you've been to Ypres? And it's like this, fields and fields full of indistinguishable white crosses. And this is very important, okay, that everybody gets basically the same cross. Some have very simple things written on them, most have none whatsoever. Now, as you can imagine, this leaves a huge hole. Culturally, this leaves a huge hole back in Britain itself. How is it that the British population can come to terms with the loss of this many people? And this many people buried in places that most families had no hope of being able to visit. Absolutely no hope. So the response to this was a wave of the construction of war memorials in Britain itself to memorialize the men lost from that town or that village so that they were symbolically brought back to the center of that community's life. The Imperial War Museum in Britain has so far catalogued over 60,000 of these memorials. And almost all of them were raised by public subscription. That is to say that people gave money in order for them to be built. In 1923, they passed an act that says once they're built, the local authority will take over the maintenance of them. But they're basically raised from privately raised funds. And any of you that have visited Britain know that there isn't a town or a village that you can go to that doesn't have one of these things. This is my personal favourite because this is in Glossop, outside of Manchester, where I used to live. You remember I was telling you about that bakery that shut down for Wakes Week? Yeah? The bakery was right here. So this is the town centre. I know it doesn't really work, but it does for me because I've been there. I used to come out of the shop and, oh yes, there's a war memorial. This is a highly unusual war memorial because it's the figure of this winged figure is far more ornate than most war memorials. Most war memorials are very, very straightforward, you know, and very much in the tradition of design that comes out of the Imperial War Graves Memorial. Much plainer, much more straightforwardly monumental, not as delicate or ornate as the one in Glossop. So this is a small mill town, okay? A mill town based came up in the 19th century. A lot of textile mills. I forget what the population is. There's this, but there are also 14 other memorials in Glossop alone for the First World War. Many of them in churches or chapels. So it wasn't just the town that remembered its dead. Then every church or chapel often also constructed their own memorials for the people from their congregation that was lost. And on top of that, many aristocratic families, which still had, you know, their own churches effectively, you know, on the estates, would put up great plaques within the church in memory of their children that were lost. So the dead, I'm suggesting, even though they're kept where they die by the state, even though death is democratized for them in that experience, the British population brings them back through this practice of memorialization at home. Any questions before? Yeah, sure. Well, there was a lot of unidentified bodies, and they're either buried in unknown graves, or what they often frequently do is, I mean, this is the case in Verdun, because I remember this from a visit myself. They build these great chapels in honor of the unknown dead. And so the one in Verdun is actually full of bleached bones underneath. You walk around and you see the bleached bones of the dead. And of course, there are tombs and memorials in Britain. I mean, is it Trafalgar Square? There's one in a tomb to, you know, lots of memorials to the unknown soldiers back in Britain. Any other questions? Yeah, Bob. No. Well, yes, there is. No, there isn't. On, I think we call it Veterans Day here, in the 11th of November. On that day, or for the month preceding it, in Britain, there's a tradition that people wear plastic red poppies. Okay, I'll be wearing. Oh well, I'm not. We're not going to be. Is it? Yeah, it is November coming up. Yeah, I'll be wearing one, so you'll see it. It's a tradition that people wear this red poppy, okay? And the proceeds for the sale of the red poppy goes to the Royal Legion, okay? So many people believe that buying those poppies is supporting and valorizing the military culture that led to these deaths. So they invented an alternative poppy, which was a white poppy of peace, basically. So it's not, there's a relation to the practices of memorialization, but the white poppy is basically a type of protest poppy against war itself. Yeah. Yeah.
Were those tied to any particular religious groups, or was it just
Well, there were lots of reasons why people conscientiously objected. They could do so on religious grounds because, say, they were Quakers. And you know, so but a lot of Quakers were engaged in non-combatant work. They could conscientiously object because of their politics, because they were, you know, because they were on the left and they were or they were just pacifists. So I mean, a large spectrum. Some people conscientiously objected simply because they felt that it would be deserting their family. I mean, for instance, say you you were raised on a small farm, and you've got aged parents, and if you go to, you know, if you get called up, then there's no one there to run the farm. So people had arguments that ranged from the ethical to the political to the religious, just to the deeply practical. And there were a lot of arrangements made for people that had that was necessary for the farming community, especially. There are a lot of exceptions. Yeah, Tom. Right. There were, well, I mean, the farming community is the biggest. There were some heavy industrial industries that were protected, but what they did there mainly was to get older men to work them, so that they would try and, it was an age thing, that you could if men say in their, say, I'm 46, so in 1916 I would have missed the cut by 5 years, but I would have been young enough, not really, but I could have been working in a steel mill, for instance, at that age. So anyone under 40 would not be, would have to go in those conditions. So I mean, I think that mining is another example which is a really set of specialist skills and key strategic needs. So there were, but it was a very ad hoc. Not ad hoc. There was a process, but there were lots of variations and different local conditions and exceptions. Yeah.
With so many men being lost, was there any government support for families that would eventually have a single mother setting up?
Yeah, there's a great question. There was a war widows pension introduced. I think after the war, actually, at the same time that the disability pensions were introduced. I think that's the case. There's certainly a war pension introduced, war widows pension, and I'm not clear on the date. Anyone know that? No? Okay, you ready for your earth-shattering Thursday conclusion? I know you can't wait. So I hope that you get the sense that this war was a truly cataclysmic event, that it sent a sort of seismic shock waves through all of Europe and through Britain as well. In many ways, it's an experience that comes to define not just the next 10 or 20 years, but arguably much of the rest of the 20th century in Britain. Okay? Britain emerges, ironically, seemingly in a pretty strong position, and yet, in important ways, it remains really fatally undermined. And we'll come back to that. The key thing that you need to get immediately is that many people believe that the Great War marked the end of the version of liberal Britain that I have been talking about in the semester so far. That culturally, the idea of progress, for instance, the idea of a progressive advance of humankind was irrevocably shattered. Industrial progress had led to industrial death and violence. The idea of heroic imperial adventure had led to the mindless slaughter in the mud of the trenches. It also, the conditions of fighting the war, required an entirely new type of government that